All right, hey everyone. If you're tuning in for this deep dive, chances are you're prepping for the UPSC, specifically those IR questions. And trust me, this one's going to be really helpful. We're going deep on Hegel.
Oh, Hegel.
Yeah. Now, he's a big name in political thought, but
Yeah.
his ideas can be, well, a little dense,
Dense is a good word.
but also super insightful,
Mhm.
especially if you're trying to figure out how states work, the whole international scene.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting about Hegel is he doesn't see the state as just this necessary evil just to keep things in order.
Right, right.
It's not just about security like Hobbes would say.
Yeah.
For Hegel, the state is something much bigger, much grander. It's like the ultimate ethical ideal.
Good now.
Where individual aspirations and the common good come together.
Hold on. So he's saying the state isn't just about, preventing chaos.
Yeah.
It's actually the best way for us to live morally good lives.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, especially for IR, right? Where things can get, well, a bit messy.
It definitely challenges how we usually think about things.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of the state as an ethical ideal, it's key to understanding Hegel's whole system.
Yeah.
It's about, realizing our full potential, not just as individuals, but as part of this larger community. He calls it universal altruism.
Universal altruism.
Yeah, this idea that within the state, everyone's interests are kind of intertwined.
Okay, so I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So it's not just me pursuing my own self-interest, but somehow in the state, my self-interest aligns with everyone else's. I mean, doesn't that sound a little too idealistic?
It definitely pushes us to think differently.
Especially in IR, where it's all about states competing,
Yeah,
right?
But stick with me here. This is where Hegel gets really interesting.
Okay.
He talks a lot about the rule of law.
Right. Rule of law, that's a big one.
But not how you might think.
Okay, yeah. Usually we think of laws as limitations, things that restrict our freedom. I have a feeling Hegel's got a different take on this.
He does. Hegel actually says that law, it's not a restriction on freedom, but it's the condition that makes freedom possible.
Okay, now how does that work?
Think about it.
Yeah.
Without laws, without any structure, wouldn't we just be at the mercy of whoever's strongest or most ruthless?
Yeah, it'd be like that, the state of nature Hobbes talks about, right?
Yeah.
Just constant conflict.
Exactly, a war of all against all. Real freedom, for Hegel, it can only exist within this framework of laws.
Okay.
Laws that, protect us from arbitrary power, ensure we're all playing by the same rules.
So it's like, imagine a game, but with no rules.
Right.
It would just be chaos, right? You need rules,
Yeah.
even though they seem restrictive, to actually play the game.
That's a great analogy.
So that's what Hegel's getting at.
Yeah, laws, in a way, create the space for us to be truly free. And it's within that structure, that framework, that we can pursue our own goals, exercise our rights.
Makes sense.
And it's important to note, he's talking about codified laws, rational laws.
Not just like some vague idea.
No, grounded in reason, reflecting the shared values of the community.
Okay, so no natural law for Hegel.
No, it's about laws that are created, through deliberation, reflecting the will of the people.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the law provides the playing field, where individual freedom can actually flourish. And as an IR student, I can already see how this applies to the international system. But wait, didn't Hegel also talk about something called the universal class?
He did.
Which is basically his term for the bureaucracy, right?
Exactly, and this is a crucial part of his ideal state.
Okay.
He sees the bureaucracy, this universal class, as this neutral force. They're recruited based on merit, not connections or wealth.
Right.
Their job is to make sure the state operates in the best interest of everyone.
So it's almost like a group of guardians, like Plato's philosopher-kings. But instead of ruling, they're managing.
There are definitely some similarities to Plato there.
Okay.
But Hegel is very much thinking about the modern world.
Right.
He's talking about a professional, meritocratic bureaucracy.
Yeah.
One that's accountable, operates according to clear rules. He even says these civil servants should have fixed salaries.
Fixed salaries.
Yeah.
That's an interesting detail.
To prevent corruption.
To keep them impartial.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this all goes back to the state as the embodiment of ethical life.
Right.
True freedom, for Hegel, comes from acting rationally, aligning our actions with the universal good. And the state, with its rational laws and impartial bureaucracy, provides the framework for that.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty compelling vision, even if it sounds a bit, well, idealistic at times. But there's one thing about Hegel that always puzzled me, especially as an IR student. Why, why would a philosopher who's all about reason and logic be a proponent of monarchy? It seems so outdated.
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people struggle with. It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that Hegel's monarch, he's not this all-powerful ruler. Like, he's not talking about Louis the Fifth or some tyrannical king.
Okay, so what kind of monarch did he have in mind?
Hegel saw the monarch as more of a symbol, someone who embodies the unity, the continuity of the state.
Hmm.
Think of it less as a ruler and more like a living representation of the Constitution, a symbol of the nation.
Okay, so kind of like the Queen of England. A symbol, but without any real political power.
In some ways, yes.
Okay.
But Hegel went even further. He rejected the idea of an elected monarch.
Really?
He argued that hereditary succession was essential
Okay.
because it meant the monarch embodies the entire Constitution, the whole history and tradition of the state, not just the will of a particular party or faction.
That's a really different way of looking at monarchy than what we usually think of. It's not about power, but about representing something much larger.
Exactly.
But if the monarch is just a symbol, then who actually holds the power in Hegel's state?
That's where it gets even more interesting,
Okay, I'm intrigued.
especially for you as an IR student.
All right, well, for all our listeners out there, we're going to dive into that in the next part of our deep dive on Hegel.
Stay tuned.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. So let's pick up where we left off and see how these Hegelian concepts, these often abstract ideas about the state, how they actually play out in the real world, in international relations.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners, especially those gearing up for those IR questions, might be wondering how all this talk about ethical ideals and universal classes actually connects to, well, the often messy reality of global politics. I mean, it's one thing to talk about a harmonious state, but quite another to deal with national interests, power struggles, all the complexities of international organizations.
Yeah, you're hitting on a key point here.
Yeah.
The world doesn't neatly fit into Hegel's ideal state. We know that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean his ideas are irrelevant.
Right.
Quite the opposite. Even in the chaotic world of IR, ideas matter. They shape how states see their interests, how they justify their actions, how they try to, build some kind of order on the global stage.
So you're saying that even though we don't see perfect Hegelian states out there, his concepts can still help us understand the underlying motivations and structures at play in international relations.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Hegel provides a framework, a lens, through which you can analyze the behavior of states and the dynamics of the international system. Let's take the concept of the universal class, the bureaucracy.
Right, right.
Now think about international organizations like the UN or the WTO.
Okay.
They're staffed with individuals who, in theory, are supposed to be impartial.
Yeah, their job is to focus on the common good, not just the interests of their own countries.
Exactly.
So even on a global scale, we're seeing attempts, however imperfect, to create these institutions that reflect Hegel's vision, like that neutral body working for the benefit of all.
Precisely. And this raises some crucial questions for you UPSC folks to think about. How well do these international organizations actually live up to those principles of impartiality and rationality that Hegel emphasized?
Right.
What challenges do they face when trying to balance national interests with global concerns? How do power dynamics play out within these institutions?
Yeah, those are big questions.
These are the kinds of questions that can really, set you apart in those UPSC essays and interviews.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing what Hegel said. It's about using his ideas as tools to analyze real-world situations.
Exactly.
And that's where IR really comes in. You need to be able to connect the philosophical dots to the concrete realities of global politics.
Absolutely. And to do that, you need to be comfortable grappling with the nuances of Hegel's thought.
Right.
Let's take his views on law and individual freedom.
Okay.
How do those play out in the context of international law?
That's a good one, because we all know that international law is often seen as, well, weak and ineffective, especially compared to domestic law. There's no global police force to enforce it. What would Hegel make of this? Would he even consider international law to be, like, real law?
Well, remember, for Hegel, law wasn't just about enforcement and punishment.
Right.
It was about creating a framework for ethical action, for realizing our freedom within a system of shared norms and values.
Hmm.
So even if international law lacks, that coercive power of a strong state,
Right.
it can still play a crucial role in shaping how states behave and setting expectations,
Hmm.
creating a sense of shared responsibility.
So even though there's no global authority with the power to, enforce international law in the same way that a state can enforce its laws domestically, the very existence of these agreements, these treaties, can still influence state behavior and promote cooperation.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Think about treaties on human rights, environmental protection, or the laws of war. These may not always prevent violations, but they establish standards, create accountability mechanisms,
Like they provide a framework.
and they can mobilize pressure for compliance.
Okay.
They provide a framework for what's considered acceptable behavior on the international stage.
I see what you mean. It's like setting the rules of the game, even if you can't always guarantee that everyone will follow them perfectly.
Exactly.
And for someone studying IR, this is really important because it helps us understand how international law, even with its limitations, can actually contribute to a more stable and just world order.
Precisely.
Mm.
It's about understanding the subtle ways in which ideas can shape actions, even on the global stage.
Okay.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and tackle another challenging aspect of Hegel's thought, one that often throws people off. His defense of monarchy.
Yeah, that's the one I was just about to ask about. Monarchy, it seems like a relic of the past, especially in the context of international relations. How can we possibly make sense of this idea in today's world of, democratic states and international organizations?
Remember, Hegel's concept of monarchy was very specific.
Right.
It wasn't about absolute power or ruling through force.
Okay.
It was about symbolizing unity, continuity, representing the whole of the state. Now, think about that in the context of international relations.
Okay.
What are some of the challenges posed by the absence of a central unifying authority on the global stage?
Well, off the top of my head, I mean, we see a lot of fragmentation, competition, difficulty in coordinating collective action on, issues that require global cooperation, like climate change. Everyone's looking out for their own interests. There's no real mechanism to enforce global agreements
Exactly.
or ensure everyone contributes fairly.
Now, I'm not saying we need a global monarch to solve these problems,
Right.
but understanding Hegel's emphasis on the need for a unifying force, even if it's largely symbolic,
Yeah.
can help us analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the current international system. It highlights the challenges of achieving true global governance without some kind of mechanism to, represent the collective will, ensure accountability.
So by studying Hegel, UPSC aspirants can gain a deeper understanding of not only the historical development of political thought, but also the contemporary challenges of, global governance. It's like he's giving us a set of conceptual tools to kind of dissect the complexities of the international system.
Precisely.
Right.
And this brings us to another key aspect of Hegel's philosophy that's particularly relevant for IR, his critique of popular sovereignty.
You mentioned this earlier. Why was Hegel so skeptical of the idea of, like, the people being the ultimate source of political authority? It seems like democracy is a dominant model today, both domestically and increasingly in how we think about international relations.
Hegel believed that the concept of the people was often too abstract and masked the deep divisions and competing interests within society.
Okay.
He argued that simply having elections and majority rule wasn't enough to guarantee a just and stable political order. Remember, he preferred an assembly of estates, representing diverse sectors of society,
Right.
rather than a system based solely on popular election.
So he was wary of the potential for tyranny of the majority, where the rights of minorities could be trampled upon. And he believed that a more nuanced approach to representation was necessary, one that took into account the complexity and diversity of interests within society.
Exactly. And this is particularly relevant when we think about international relations.
Right.
The international system, it's made up of diverse states, each with its own internal complexities and competing interests.
Right. It's like each state is its own little microcosm of those competing factions, just like those estates Hegel talked about. So even though states are often presented as these, unified actors on the world stage, we need to remember that they are themselves composed of diverse groups with their own agendas and motivations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Understanding this internal complexity of states can be crucial for analyzing their behavior in the international arena. It challenges that simplistic notion of states as monolithic entities
Mhm.
and helps us grasp the domestic factors that can influence foreign policy decisions.
Wow, this is giving me a lot to think about. It really shows how engaging with these complex philosophical ideas can actually be incredibly practical
Hmm.
for those studying international relations.
Hmm.
It's not just abstract theory, it's about developing a deeper understanding of how the world really works.
Precisely.
Okay.
And there's one final point I want to raise before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Remember Hegel's concept of the state as the embodiment of ethical life.
Right.
That
Got it.
idea of aligning individual actions with the universal good.
Yeah.
Now, think about the concept of global citizenship,
Hmm.
the growing interconnectedness of the world, the challenges that transcend national borders.
Right.
Could we see the emergence of a global ethical consciousness,
Mhm.
a sense of shared responsibility for the well-being of humanity as a whole?
That's a fascinating question, and it really gets to the heart of some of the biggest debates in international relations today, right? Issues like climate change, pandemics, global inequality, they demand cooperation, a sense of shared responsibility that goes beyond national borders. It's almost like we need a global version of that ethical life Hegel talked about.
Exactly. It's a question that's open to debate, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But Hegel's ideas can help us frame these debates in a more nuanced and insightful way. They challenge us to think about the relationship between individual actions, state behavior, and the possibility of a more just and ethical world order.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see international relations through a whole new lens.
Mm.
It's amazing how these ideas from centuries ago can still be so relevant and thought-provoking today.
Hegel was definitely onto something.
Yeah.
And for our UPSC aspirants, I encourage you to delve deeper into his work.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to wrestle with those complex ideas.
Right.
The insights you gain will be invaluable as you analyze the intricacies of international relations and prepare for your exams.
Great advice.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some specific examples of how Hegel's ideas can be applied to analyze real-world events, let's take a quick break.
Okay, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Hegel, and I'm excited to see how we can actually use his ideas to understand, like, real events in international relations. It's like taking all those abstract concepts and actually putting them to the test.
Exactly. Let's put on our Hegelian glasses, so to speak, and see how his philosophy helps us make sense of some of the biggest issues in global politics.
Right, that's good.
And for those UPSC folks, pay close attention. This is the kind of analysis that can really make your exam answers stand out.
Okay, so where do we start? I'm thinking about some of the big challenges we're facing today, like the rise of new powers, the shifting global influence, the tensions between different political systems. It feels like we're in constant flux, kind of like that Hegelian dialectic we talked about.
You know, that's a great observation.
Yeah.
It highlights how Hegel can help us understand not just specific events, but the bigger historical trends that are shaping the international system.
Okay.
Remember his concept of the state as this ethical ideal, where individual and universal interests are supposed to come together.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's apply that to a real-world example, the European Union.
The EU, perfect example. I mean, it's often seen as this ambitious project to, overcome historical divisions, create a more unified Europe, peaceful and prosperous.
Right.
How does Hegel help us understand this?
Think about the core principles of the EU: cooperation, shared sovereignty, rule of law, free movement of people and goods.
Okay.
These all resonate with Hegel's vision of the state as a framework for achieving individual and collective well-being.
So the EU, even though it's not a perfect Hegelian state,
Uh-huh.
it represents an attempt to create a kind of superstate,
Mhm.
right, that embodies those ideals on a larger scale, a way to bring order and harmony to a region that's, well, historically been prone to conflict.
Exactly.
Right.
And by looking at the EU through Hegel, we can understand its motivations, its successes, and its challenges, in a much deeper way.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Because like Hegel gives us this framework to analyze not just how states work internally, but how they try to cooperate, build a more stable international order.
Mhm.
But what about when things break down? What about when we see like open conflict between states? Can Hegel help us make sense of those situations too?
Absolutely. Let's look at the tensions between China and Taiwan.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one.
Complex issue, historical, geopolitical, ideological dimensions.
For sure.
But one key aspect, and one that Hegel can really shed light on, is the struggle for recognition.
Right. Recognition. That was huge for Hegel. It's the idea that States need to be acknowledged as legitimate by other states
Yeah.
in order to, like, fully realize themselves.
Exactly. And with China and Taiwan, we see this playing out very clearly.
Right.
China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province, part of its own sovereignty and identity,
Yeah.
while Taiwan seeks autonomy and recognition as a separate entity.
So from a Hegelian perspective, this conflict isn't just about territory. It's about identity, recognition. Each side feels like its legitimacy is at stake, which makes, compromise and peaceful resolution a lot harder.
Exactly, and it shows how important it is to understand the historical narratives, the ideological frameworks that shape how states see themselves and their place in the world.
Mm.
It's not just about power, it's about these deeper assumptions about who deserves to be recognized and on what terms.
This is a perfect example of how Hegel helps us see beyond the surface, right?
Right.
Get to the heart of what's really driving the conflict.
Exactly, and this is what you UPS folks should be aiming for, that nuance analysis,
Mm.
showing that you can apply these complex ideas to the real world, demonstrating a deeper understanding of what shapes international relations.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned before, the possibility of a global ethical consciousness, that shared responsibility for humanity. It's a powerful idea, especially in a world facing so many challenges that need, cooperation and collective action.
Mm.
Did Hegel ever envision something like this? Could we ever see a truly Hegelian world state?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Hegel himself was skeptical of a world state.
Mm.
He believed the nation-state was the highest form of political organization.
Right.
But he was writing in a different time.
True. The world was a very different place back then. Today, we have globalization, interconnectedness, a growing awareness of our shared fate. Could this lead to a new form of global political organization, one that reflects those Hegelian ideals on a global scale?
It's certainly possible and worth thinking about. We see hints of this global consciousness in international institutions, the influence of transnational actors, the interconnectedness of our economies and societies.
But there's also a lot of pushback, right? We see rising nationalism, a retreat from global cooperation,
Yeah.
that resurgence of great power competition. It's like we're stuck between these forces of integration and fragmentation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension, that struggle is what makes IR so fascinating.
For sure.
And it's where Hegel's ideas are most helpful. They give us a framework to understand the forces that shape the world order, the competing visions for the future, the potential paths toward a more just and peaceful world.
Wow, this has been an incredible journey through Hegel. We just scratched the surface, but it's given me a whole new way of looking at international relations.
That's the power of philosophy. It challenges us to think critically, question our assumptions, see the world in new ways.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there, especially those prepping for the UPSC, keep exploring these ideas. Delve into political philosophy, and never stop questioning the world around you.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for more explorations of these fascinating topics. Until next time.